I wish I knew how it would feel to be free. I wish I could break all the chains holding me. I wish I could say all the things that I should say. Say them loud, say them clear, for the whole round world to hear. I wish I could share all the love that's in my heart. Remove all the bars that keep us apart. I wish you could know what it means to be me. Then you'd see and agree that every man should be free.
The American slave trade began back in colonial days. New England sea captains filled their ships with Virginia tobacco, then sailed east across the Atlantic to the ports of Britain, the first leg of a great triangle. In England, the tobacco was exchanged for guns and cloth and trinkets. Then the American ships sailed south for Africa. There, their holds were filled with black men, women, and children, the most valuable cargo of all. An 18th century African described his enslavement.
The persons who captured us received payment in the form of various articles, a keg of liquor, and some yards of blue and red cotton cloth. I had never seen white people before, and they appeared to me the ugliest creatures in the world.
On the final leg of the Great Triangle, the Africans were shipped west in a voyage that became known as the Middle Passage. A British abolitionist named Robert Walsh was an eyewitness to the conditions of a slave ship at sea.
The slaves were all enclosed under grated hatchways between decks. The space was so low they sat between each other's legs, and there was no possibility of lying down or at all changing their position by night or day. Over the hatchway stood a ferocious-looking fellow with a scourge of many twisted thongs in his hand, who was the slave driver of the ship. The last parting sounds we heard from the unhallowed ship were the cries and shrieks of the slaves suffering under some bodily affliction.
African men, women, and children were sold at southern ports. There was not a colony in America that did not profit from slavery. The minister named Henry Highland Garnett would later state, there was not a single black American whose family did not arrive here by way of slavery.
Our race was brought to the shores of America. They came not with glad spirits to a land of freedom. They came with broken hearts and were doomed to unrequited toil and degradation.
Children, go where I send thee. Where will you send me?
By 1800, there were about 1 million black slaves living in America, mostly in the cotton-growing South. Americans weren't the first people to own slaves, but slavery quickly took on distinctly American features.
Well, slavery has existed, sad to say, for virtually all of human history. But slavery, as it developed in the New World, was different from previous slaveries. Previously, slavery had usually been household slavery, where a slave owner would own 1 or 2 slaves. There wasn't a large concentration of slaves in any one place. Here, it was plantation slavery. Slavery was part of large agricultural units, often with hundreds of slaves, so that the concentration of slaves was very high, the population of slaves was very high, and the policing of the system was very brutal because you had a danger of revolt all the time because you had far more slaves than free people in these slaveholding regions.
New laws called Black Codes were written in the southern states defining slaves as property, not people. But in the slave owner's view, property that could think meant trouble. So additional laws were passed to try to prevent slaves from thinking.
The teaching of slaves has a tendency to excite dissatisfaction in their minds. Therefore, any free person who shall teach any slave to read and write shall be liable to indictment. If any slave shall teach or attempt to teach any other slave, he or she shall receive 39 lashes on his or her bare back.
Southerners began to say that God had created some people to be slaves and some to be masters. They said black people weren't as smart as white people. Conditions for slaves on southern plantations were deplorable, as Josiah Henson, a Maryland slave, described.
We lodged in log huts and on the bare ground. In a single room were huddled like cattle, 10 or a dozen persons, men, women, and children. We had neither bedsteads nor furniture of any description. Our beds were collections of straw and old rags. The wind whistled and the rain and snow blew in through the cracks, and the damp earth soaked in the moisture till the floor was miry as a pigsty. In these wretched hovels we were penned at night and fed by day. Here were the children born and the sick neglected.
On a tour of the South, the landscape designer and writer Frederick Olmsted witnessed the cruelty of the plantation system.
Each overseer regulated the hours of work of his own plantation. The whip was in constant use. There were no rules on the subject. Overseers and drivers punished the Negroes whenever they deemed it necessary, and with such severity as they saw fit. I said to one of the overseers, "It must be disagreeable to have to punish them as much as you do." "Yes," he said, "but it's my business, and I think nothing of it. Why, sir, I wouldn't mind killing the nigger more than I would a dog."
By the late 1830s, there were about 2,000 groups of activists in the North who were speaking out against slavery, the abolitionists. While some talked of gradually freeing the slaves and even paying the owners the cash value of their loss, most wanted immediate emancipation. William Lloyd Garrison from Massachusetts was founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society.
I do not wish to think or speak or write with moderation. No, tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm, but urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard.
The abolitionist movement is absolutely central in our history in rethinking what American freedom is. It's really from the abolitionist movement that many modern ideas of freedom spring. Remember, African Americans were all born here by this period, but they were not considered American citizens. The abolitionists said these are Americans. They are not Africans. They are not foreigners. They are not aliens. They must be recognized as part of our society. So the abolitionists are not only attacking slavery, they are attacking the boundary of freedom, the racial line around the definition of freedom, which was bequeathed by the Revolution. And they're really the people who gave birth to the idea of freedom as a universal birthright for all Americans.
By the 1840s, more and more slaves were running away from their owners and seeking freedom in the North. A support system was developed to help them escape to places like New York, Massachusetts, and Canada. It came to be known as the Underground Railroad. Levi Coffin was an Ohio Quaker who helped run the system.
The fugitives generally arrived in the night and were hidden in the upper room of our house. We kept them as secluded as possible until a way could be provided for safely forwarding them on their way to Canada.
One of the most famous workers in the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman, who personally led more than 300 slaves to freedom. Tubman herself was an escaped slave who fled from Maryland in the 1840s. When she first arrived in free territory as a young woman, it was a moment she never forgot.
When I found I had crossed the line, I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven.
She decided to dedicate her life to helping others escape, beginning with her own family members and friends.
I was free, and they should be free. I would make a home in the North and bring them there.
Over the next years, Harriet became one of the most wanted fugitives in the entire South, but she was never caught, and for her courageous work helping lead slaves to freedom, she earned the nickname of Moses Tubman.
There was one of two things I had a right to, liberty or death. If I could not have one, I would have the other, for no man should take me alive.
In 1841, a runaway slave, a tall, handsome man named Frederick Douglass, spoke up at an abolitionist meeting on Nantucket Island near Boston.
I felt strongly moved to speak, but the truth was, I felt myself a slave, and the idea of speaking to white people weighed me down.
Yet somehow, he found the courage to speak out. That evening, Frederick Douglass told his own story, how he had lived and what he had seen. That was enough to send chills down the backs of his listeners.
I never saw my mother more than 4 or 5 times in my life. She made her journeys to see me in the night, traveling the whole distance on foot, 12 miles, after the performance of her day's work. She was a field hand, and a whipping is the penalty of not being in the field at sunrise. I do not recollect ever seeing my mother by the light of day.
As a young slave, Frederick became determined to read and write. He traded bread with white children for reading lessons. But when he was sent away to a cruel new master, he was beaten with a whip until he was bloody and scarred. He wasn't given enough to eat. He was sent into the fields to work long hours.
But for the hope of being free, I have no doubt that I should have killed myself.
What happened next was all put down in a book he wrote called Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. What he left out of his book was a description of exactly how he had escaped to freedom. If he had included it, the slave catchers would have known how to capture others who were using the same route. By 1850, Douglass had become a hugely influential leader and editor of the abolitionist newspaper, the North Star.
People in general will say they liked colored men as well as any other, but in their proper place. They assign us that place. They don't let us do it ourselves, nor will they allow us a voice in the decision. They will not allow that we have a head to think, and a heart to feel, and a soul to aspire. You degrade us, and then you ask why we are degraded. You shut our mouths, and then ask why we don't speak. You close your colleges and seminaries against us, and then ask why we don't know more.
Frederick Douglass was probably the greatest figure in the abolitionist movement. He represents the fact that African Americans played a major role in the struggle against slavery. The notion of racial inequality was deeply embedded in American society. In a country that defines itself as a land of liberty, you need an explanation for why 4 million people are deprived of liberty. Racial inequality becomes that explanation. It becomes the reason why you can have slavery in a land of freedom.
By the 1850s, there were 4 million slaves in America. And across the nation, the issue of slavery was becoming a burning topic of debate. But it was in the state of Illinois that the issue was to become most dramatically focused. At the center of the controversy was Senator Stephen A. Douglas, who at just over 5 feet tall was known as the Little Giant. One of the most energetic and powerful voices in the Senate, Douglas had strong pro-Southern leanings.
It is true that my wife owns about 150 acres in Mississippi on a cotton plantation, but the public have no business with my private affairs.
In 1854, in part to benefit himself as a Western landowner, Douglas wrote a bill for Congress that let loose a firestorm. It was called the Kansas-Nebraska Bill, and it divided the Western Territory into two huge regions, Kansas and Nebraska. The ban on slavery in those territories, which had been in place since the Missouri Compromise of 1820, was to be ended. Instead, it would be left to the free residents of each territory to decide whether or not to introduce slavery.
Let each state mind its own business and let its neighbors alone, and there will be no trouble on this question.
Among the many who were not pleased was an Illinois lawyer named Abraham Lincoln.
It is wrong in its effect, letting slavery into Kansas and Nebraska, and wrong in principle, allowing it to spread to every other part of the world where men can be found inclined to take it.
Abraham Lincoln was a self-educated lawyer who was friendly, honest, and highly successful in the courtroom. He also had a personal hatred for the institution of slavery.
Whenever I hear anyone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally.
In 1858, Lincoln was chosen by the newly formed Republican Party to run against Douglas for the U.S. Senate. That summer, Lincoln and Douglas each traveled across Illinois, speaking to large crowds at train stops and in meeting halls. At 7 of these stops, they appeared together for what became known as the Lincoln-Douglas debates.
I hold that the signers of the Declaration of Independence had no reference to Negroes at all when they declared all men to be created equal. They did not mean the Negro, nor the savage Indians, nor the Fiji Islanders, nor any other barbarous race. They were speaking of white men.
Our fathers left slavery in the course of ultimate extinction. Judge Douglas and his friends wish it to become national and perpetual. He is blowing out the moral lights around us.
It does not become Mr. Lincoln or anybody else to tell people that they have no consciences. Judge not, lest ye shall be judged.
The Democratic Party has deliberately taken Negroes from the class of men and put them in the class of brutes. I want every man to have a chance, and I believe a black man is entitled to it.
The Lincoln-Douglas debates revolved on the question of American freedom. Douglas takes the very common view at that time that freedom is for white people. Freedom means the right of local communities to govern themselves, including having slavery if they feel like it. The Declaration of Independence, Douglas says this very explicitly, only applies to white people, but not to blacks at all. Lincoln says, no, those principles are for everybody. They're universal. They're not just confined by race. And that slavery is a violation of American freedom. You can't allow local communities to decide for themselves. This is a national issue which has to be settled by a national majority. So in a sense, they're debating what freedom is, whether slavery is contradictory to freedom, and who should decide on the ultimate fate of slavery in the United States.
We began by declaring that all men are created equal, but now we have run down to the other declaration that for some men to enslave others is a sacred right of government. These principles cannot stand together.
In the fall of 1858, Stephen Douglas defeated Abraham Lincoln and won re-election as senator from Illinois. But the tall country lawyer was now well known, and the issue of slavery had risen to the top of the national agenda. Just 2 years later, following a contentious election, Lincoln was elected President of the United States. A shudder of horror rippled through the South as newspapers recorded.
The New Orleans Crescent. The Northern people in electing Mr. Lincoln have perpetrated a deliberate, cold-blooded insult and outrage on the people of the slave-holding states.
The Richmond Dispatch. The election of Abraham Lincoln has put the country in peril.
The Augusta Constitutionalist. The South should arm at once.
Before Lincoln even had the chance to take office, Southern states began seceding from the Union. Alexander Stephens was a leading Southern figure.
All efforts to save the Union will be unavailing. The truth is, our leaders and public men do not desire to continue it on any terms.
South Carolina led the way. Mississippi, one of the richest states in the nation, followed eagerly. So did Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. In all, 11 states would leave the Union and form the Confederate States of America. In February 1861, those Confederate states elected their own president, Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. At his inauguration, he said, "All we ask is to be left alone."
The audience was large and brilliant, but beyond them I saw troubles and thorns innumerable. My opinion was that there would be war, long and bloody, and that it behooved everyone to put his house in order.
The following month, at his own inauguration in Washington, a now bearded Abraham Lincoln tried to reassure the angry South.
We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection.
Just 6 weeks later, on April 14, 1861, Southern guns fired on a small federal fort in the harbor at Charleston, South Carolina. An eyewitness described it.
A perfect sheet of flame flashed out, a deafening roar, a rumbling, deadening sound, and the war was on.
For 84 years since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the United States had stood strong as a free republic. Now, the issue of slavery, the terrible contradiction at the nation's center, was putting at risk the entire American experiment in freedom.
The last ray of hope for preserving the Union peaceably expired at the assault upon Fort Sumter. This issue embraces more than the fate of these United States. It presents to the whole family of man the question whether a constitutional republic can or cannot maintain its integrity.
Wish I could be like